Wyoming Territory, August 1878. Dust curled from the hooves of a lone horse cutting across the dry basin outside of Laramie, the sun just beginning to dip low, painting the plains in orange and gold. A woman stood stiff-backed on the porch of the one-room schoolhouse, arms folded tight over her chest, her eyes locked on the approaching rider. Delaney Whitlow had not expected trouble today, but trouble had a way of finding her. The man dismounted with a heavy thud, tall and broad-shouldered, his shadow swallowing the last step before the porch. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and a worn coat that stretched across his chest like it had been stitched for someone even larger. His eyes, deep set beneath dark brows, met hers with something quiet and unreadable. "You the schoolteacher?" he asked, voice low, rough from dust and distance. Delaney nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around the edge of her shawl. "I am. Who are you?" He took off his hat, revealing shaggy black hair and a face hardened by years under the sun. "Abe Harlan. I run cattle west of here. My sister Sophia sent word. Said you might need help." Delaney's jaw clenched. "I told her not to meddle." Abe shrugged. "She meddles. Always has." Behind her, the schoolhouse door creaked open. A soft voice called out, "Miss Delaney?" Delaney turned. "Go back inside, Grace. I will be just a moment." The girl, barely 7, watched Abe with cautious eyes before slipping behind the door. Abe's gaze followed. "Yours?" Delaney hesitated. "Not by blood. Her and her baby brother were left on the school steps after their mother passed this spring. No one came for them. Town won't take them. The town does not care. They barely care about me." Abe studied her, his face unreadable. "You live out here alone with 2 kids?" "Grace and Gideon," she said. "I do what I can." He stepped up one more stair, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "You look like you have not slept in days." She didn't answer. His jaw twitched. "You said no one helps you?" "No one sticks around long enough," she said, and her voice cracked despite herself. "The last man who offered help tried to take the deed to this place in exchange. So you will understand if I do not give much weight to strangers on horseback." Abe's gaze didn't waver. "I am not here to take anything. I am here because Sophia made me promise I would check on you. Now I see what she meant." "And what is that?" "That you look like a windstorm could knock you over. That those children need someone who will not disappear when things get hard." Delaney stepped back. "I do not know you." "No," he said, stepping forward. "But I know what it is to be left behind. You do not have to trust me yet. Just let me help." The wind picked up, brushing her skirt against her legs. She crossed her arms again, more out of habit than defense. "What would you do?" "Start with fixing that fence out back before the coyotes crawl through. Then the roof. I saw the sag from the ridge." She stared at him, searching for the catch. "Free," he said. "No strings." Delaney looked toward the schoolhouse. Grace's hand now clutched the curtain, peeking. From inside came the soft wail of baby Gideon. She exhaled. "Fine. A week. That is all." Abe nodded once. "That is enough." By the 3rd day, the fence stood straight, and the roof no longer leaked after the afternoon rain. Abe did not talk much, but he worked hard, and when he thought she was not looking, he watched her. Not with hunger, not with pity, but with something steadier. Delaney began to feel it how the air shifted when he was near. He was quiet but capable, rough but respectful. He never entered the schoolhouse without knocking, never raised his voice, never asked questions he had no right to. Grace warmed to him faster than Delaney expected. Gideon took longer, but even he seemed to settle when Abe was near. On the 5th night, Delaney stepped out to find Abe sitting on the porch, sharpening his knife in the fading light. She crossed her arms, watching him. "You do not talk much." He nodded toward her. "You do enough for the both of us." She huffed a laugh. "Do you always do what your sister asks?" "No," he said, looking up. "Only when it feels right." She met his eyes, and something passed between them, something neither of them could name yet. The wind carried the scent of sage and dust, and for once, she didn't feel so small against it. On the 7th night, everything changed. Delaney stepped outside just as the sun disappeared behind the hills. She meant to thank him. She meant to say goodbye, because she assumed he'd leave that night his week of help done. But instead, she found him standing at the bottom of the porch steps, eyes dark, breath heavy. "You are leaving?" she said. He nodded. She opened her mouth to speak, but he cut her off, voice low and rough like gravel. "I am claiming you tonight, little one." Abe growled, his jaw tight. If you will have me. Delaney froze. His voice dropped, softer now. I want you, Delaney. You and those children. I have spent 7 nights hearing that baby cry and watching you try to carry the weight of 3 lives alone. I cannot ride off and pretend I do not care. Tears burned her eyes before she could stop them. You do not even know me. I know enough, he said. You are strong. You are kind. You fight like hell for what matters. And I have not wanted anything as bad as I want you. She stepped down one stair, then another, until they were face to face. His hand came up, slow and gentle, cupping her cheek. I do not know how to be a husband, he said. But I know how to stay. And I know how to love. Delaney's hands gripped his coat, and when she rose on her toes and kissed him, it was not gentle like the wind. It was honest and full of everything she had been too afraid to say. When they pulled apart, she whispered, then stay. Abe nodded, forehead against hers. I will, as long as you let me. And in the quiet Wyoming night, Delaney finally let herself believe in something again. The morning after Abe stayed, the air hung heavy with a low mist that clung to the ground like memory. Delaney stepped outside barefoot, her skirts lifted just enough to keep them from the dew-soaked grass. The schoolhouse stood quiet behind her, the children still asleep inside. She found Abe in the lean-to, already elbow-deep in saddle oil, his horse tied nearby with a fresh bale of hay. You're up early, she said, voice still thick with sleep. Abe glanced up, the corners of his eyes lined with fatigue. Didn't rest much. Figured I'd put that to use. You always work when you can't sleep? He wiped his hands on a rag, then looked at her in a way that made her pulse thrum. Not always. Sometimes I just sit still and wait for the sun. She stepped closer, arms wrapped around herself. You stayed. I meant what I said, he answered. Delaney glanced past him at the distant ridge where the land sloped toward the river. The last time someone meant something, it cost me more than I could afford. He didn't speak right away. When he did, it came quiet. You never talk about your people. They're gone, she said simply. Father caught a fever before the war ended. Mother followed him within the year. No kin after that. Just me. Abe nodded once, respectful. That's a long time to be alone. Delaney let her gaze wander to where the clouds were beginning to break. I never wanted to need anyone. He set down the rag and took a careful step toward her. Needing someone isn't weakness. I know, she said, but it still scares me. That night, Delaney sat by the hearth, stitching a patch into Grace's dress. Abe carved a piece of wood near the window, his hands slow and deliberate. The children had gone to sleep early, worn out from the heat and the long walk to the creek. Why did you leave Texas? She asked, not looking up from the hem. Abe didn't answer right away. The carving knife paused, then resumed. Got tired of burying people. Delaney's hand slowed. Family, friends, neighbors, folks I rode with. I stayed too long after the war. Thought I could make something of what was left. He set the carving down a horse's head, rough but earnest. But the land was bled out, and I was too angry to stay still. You don't seem angry now. He looked at her, steady. I'm not. Not here. Delaney folded the dress, smoothing it with slow fingers. You've given more kindness in a week than I've seen in years. I don't know how to be anything else with you, he said, voice low. The fire cracked. Outside, a night bird called once, then fell silent. Do you ever think about what comes next? She asked. I do now, he said. But only since I got here. She nodded once, then rose and set the dress aside. She approached him slowly, hands clean, face bare. They'll ask questions in town. Let them. He stood, towering over her, but never imposing. I'll answer them. Her fingers found his. I don't want to be a secret. You won't be, he said, drawing her in. You're the only thing I've felt sure of in a long time. Delaney rested her forehead against his chest. I want to believe this can last. It will, Abe whispered. Because I'll fight for it. And in that moment, quiet, unhurried, wrapped in firelight and the soft creak of the wind outside, Delaney knew he would. The cottonwoods along the river had begun to turn, their yellowing leaves rustling like dry paper in the wind. The days still held heat, but mornings came with a chill that clung to skin and settled deep in the bones. Abe rose early, as he always did, but now his movements had changed, less like a man passing through, more like one who'd begun to anchor himself to the ground he walked on. Delaney found him behind the barn that morning, splitting firewood with a rhythm that made the breath catch in her chest. She didn't speak at first, just watched. His coat was tossed on a stump, sleeves rolled up past the elbows, the muscles in his arms working steady and unhurried. She'd grown used to his presence, but not immune to the quiet strength in his frame or the steadiness in his gaze when it found hers. "I need to ride into town today," she said once he lowered the axe. "The children are running low on flour and soap. I'll go with you." He set the axe aside, brushing sawdust from his hands. Delaney hesitated. "It's a small town, Abe." "I know it." He didn't smile, but there was a warmth in his voice she hadn't heard before. "I know how small towns look at women who don't fit in their pews." She studied him, arms folded. "You're not worried about what they'll say? I've been called worse than a stranger's mistake. They think I'm nothing but stubborn and strange. Then I'll give them something else to talk about." Grace stayed with the widow Alcott, who'd taken a liking to the girl after she recited all the psalm verses from memory one Sunday morning. Gideon was bundled in Delaney's shawl, nestled against her hip, his eyes heavy with sleep by the time they hit the edge of town. They rode side by side, their horses moving slow over the rutted road. Laramie's main street was a narrow stretch of boards and dust, with the mercantile at the center and the saloon already stirring with voices behind its swinging doors. "Stay close," she said as they dismounted. "I'm not going far," Abe replied. Inside the mercantile, the room quieted the moment the bell above the door rang. Mr. Elkins behind the counter stiffened, his eyes landing on Abe, then sliding to Delaney, then back again. "Miss Whitlow," Elkins said, too polite to be kind. "Didn't expect to see you bring company." Delaney stepped forward, setting her list on the counter. "I'm here for flour, lye soap, and lamp oil." Elkins sniffed. "You'll be wanting credit again?" Before she could answer, Abe spoke. "She won't. I'll settle it." Elkins blinked. "You her husband?" "No," Abe said calmly, laying a silver coin on the counter. "But I will be." Delaney didn't speak. She stood still, Gideon's head tucked beneath her chin, heart thudding against her ribs. Elkins cleared his throat and began gathering the supplies. Outside, as Abe hoisted the sack onto his horse, Delaney touched his arm. "You didn't have to say that." "I know," he said, "but I wanted to." She looked up at him. "You sure you're ready to carry my name on your back?" "It's not a burden," he said. "It's a choice." They rode home in silence. But it was not the kind that pressed or pinched. It was the kind that held space for new things to grow. That night, after the children were laid down and the lantern turned low, Delaney sat beside him on the porch. The moon cast long shadows across the prairie. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders, then leaned a little closer. "I never imagined a man like you would stay," she said softly. "You never met a man like me before," he replied. "No," she whispered. "I haven't. I've never built a life with someone," he said. "But I want to learn how. With you." Delaney turned to him, her voice barely breath. "Then let's learn together." Abe reached for her hand, calloused fingers closing around hers with a care that made her chest ache. There was no need for more words. Not tonight. Not with the stars overhead and the steady beat of his thumb against her wrist. They sat there until the lantern burned out, until the world felt still enough to claim. The first frost came early that year, crawling across the windows like lace before dawn. Delaney woke to the sound of the wind pressing against the walls. The fire in the schoolhouse stove faded to coals. She eased out from beneath the quilt, careful not to stir Grace beside her, and padded across the creaking floor to tend the fire. Behind her, Gideon let out a soft whimper. She paused, but before she could reach for him, Abe's boots crossed the threshold from the lean-to, his frame filling the doorway. He carried a log under one arm and a wool blanket under the other. "I heard him," he said, voice quiet. "You get the fire. I'll take the boy." Delaney nodded, and they moved without needing to speak again. She watched him settle Gideon against his chest, the baby's fist curling instinctively into the coarse fabric of Abe's shirt, and something in her ease that hadn't known it was tight. Later that morning, while Grace practiced her letters under the low light of the window and Gideon dozed in the rocking cradle Abe had built from scrap boards, Delaney kneaded dough at the table. Abe leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, watching her hands. "You ever think about building something bigger?" he asked. She didn't look up. "You mean more children?" He shook his head. "No, I mean a proper home, with more than one room and a roof that doesn't need patching every 2 weeks. Delaney glanced up at him, flour dusting her apron. "I've thought about it, but thinking doesn't pour a foundation. I've got cedar stacked and curing behind the barn, Abe said. Enough for a start. She wiped her hands on a cloth. You've been planning this without me? I've been hoping, he said. That's different. She crossed to him, her hands still warm from the dough. You'd really build a house here? I would, he said. If you'd live in it with me. Delaney looked away, her voice soft. I've never had a place that was mine. You could, he said. You could have a place that's ours. That afternoon, while the children napped, they walked the edge of the property, boots crunching over frost-hardened grass. Abe pointed out a small rise near the cottonwoods where the wind broke, just right. Here, he said. It gets the light in the morning. Ground's solid. We need to dig deep for the posts, but it'll hold. Delaney crouched, running her fingers through the soil. It's good earth. You'd have a kitchen with a window, he said, and a porch where we could sit at night and listen to the crickets. You think about things like that? She asked. I think about you in them, he said. She stood, brushing her hands off. Do you know how long it would take? Long as it takes, he said. I'm not going anywhere. In the days that followed, he began measuring. He dug post holes while Grace handed him nails, and Delaney marked plans in charcoal. When the first timbers were raised, the town couldn't help but notice. It was the Reverend's wife, Mrs. Keene, who approached one morning as Delaney walked to the well. Her gloves were tight against her fingers, and her eyes flicked toward the frame of the house rising just past the edge of the schoolyard. You've taken to that man rather quickly, she said. Delaney met her gaze calmly. He's building us a home. And what are you building for him? A family, Delaney said, and a life worth staying for. Mrs. Keene's lips tightened, but she said nothing else. That night, Delaney found Abe sitting by the fire, his shirt damp with sweat from the day's work. She sat beside him, folding her legs beneath her, and laid her hand on his knee. They're watching, she said. I know, he replied. Do you care? I care about you, he said. That's enough. Delaney leaned into his shoulder, her voice nearly lost in the crackle of the flames. I think we're making something good. Abe's arm came around her, solid and sure. No, he said. We're making something lasting. And for the first time in all her years on that land, the silence around them felt like it belonged to her. To them, like the wind itself had bent to shelter what they were building. The first snow came soft, carried on a sky the color of pewter. Flakes caught in Delaney's braid as she stood outside the new house frame, the scent of pine pitch rising from the stacked beams. Abe balanced on the joists above, hammer in hand, his breath misting in the cold. She watched him work, her arms folded beneath her shawl, not from doubt, but from something deeper, a quiet awe at how far they'd come. I'll bring you something hot, she called, voice muffled by the wind. Abe didn't pause in his work. Don't you dare carry that kettle across the snow. She laughed beneath her breath and turned back toward the schoolhouse, where Grace helped arrange the bundled kindling Abe had taught her to split. Inside, the warmth held steady, and Gideon lay tucked in a cradle quilted from scraps Delaney had kept since her mother's sewing days. Nothing in the room was fine, but everything was cared for, mended, polished, made to last. She ladled stew into a tin pail and wrapped it in cloth, waiting until Gideon stirred before lifting him to her hip. Grace, I'll only be a minute, Delaney said. Keep the fire going. The girl nodded, serious as ever, already setting another log in place. Outside, Delaney followed the narrow path Abe had tramped between the house and the schoolyard. When she reached the half-framed doorway, he was already climbing down, hat dusted in snow, shoulders stiff from cold and labor. I told you not to bring food, he said, but his expression softened when she held up the pail. You're building our roof in a snowstorm, she said. You'll take the stew. He leaned close enough to press a kiss to Gideon's forehead. Cold's coming in faster than I thought. I want the roof sealed before the real storms start. Delaney handed him the pail. You'll drive yourself to the bone if I let you. Maybe, he said, crouching on the step to eat. But I'd rather be tired than unfinished. She crouched beside him, her skirt brushing the wood. You know, it doesn't have to be perfect. Abe lowered the spoon. I'm not trying for perfect. I'm trying for strong. Her breath caught, not from the wind. She looked at him then, really looked at the fine lines around his eyes, the way snow clung to the stubble on his jaw, the steadiness in the way he held her gaze. I never expected this, she said softly. He took her free hand, rubbing her fingers warm between his palms. Neither did I, but I've stopped asking why. The next week, the windows were fitted and the door hung straight. Abe made the table himself, planed smooth and square, its legs carved with simple details. Delaney sewed curtains from spare muslin. Grace chose where to hang the iron hooks for coats. And on the final day of December, they carried the children into the new house beneath a sky bright with stars. They didn't speak much that night. They didn't need to. Everything that mattered was already there: warmth, light, the soft breath of sleeping children, and the sound of the wind caught safely outside the walls. Abe stood with her by the hearth, the fire casting long shadows. He touched her hand, then her cheek, then brushed her braid back from her shoulder. "I'd marry you tomorrow if you asked," he said. Delaney tilted her face up to his. "Then I'll ask." He laughed, low and surprised, then bent to kiss her slow, sure, and full of the promise he'd made the first night he stayed. They were married 3 days later in the unfinished chapel outside town, with snow piled in drifts along the windows, and the air so cold Delaney's veil froze where it touched her breath. The Reverend's hands trembled from age, not the weather, and Grace stood beside Delaney with her shoulders straight and her chin high. Abe wore his best coat. Delaney wore her mother's brooch. They said their vows with no hesitation. Afterward, they returned to the new house together, with Gideon bundled on Abe's chest and Grace holding Delaney's gloved hand. Neighbors had left jars of preserves and tins of dried meat on the porch without waiting to be thanked. Even Mrs. Keene had set out a wrapped loaf of sweetbread tied with twine. That night, with the children asleep and the fire burning low, Delaney and Abe lay side by side beneath a quilt she'd stitched for the occasion, the stars flickering faintly through the frost-laced window. "You happy?" he asked, voice hushed in the dark. "I am," she said, her head tucked beneath his chin. "More than I ever thought I'd be." He ran his thumb along her knuckles, slow and steady. "I'll keep building for you. Whatever you need." She pressed her lips to his collarbone. "You already have." The wind howled, but the house held fast, and so did they. Years passed. Grace grew tall and clever, her hands always ink-stained from writing stories she read aloud to her brother by firelight. Gideon followed Abe through the fields, learning the weight of hammers and the quiet ways men could be strong without raising their voices. Delaney taught them both, not just their letters, but how to read the world, with care, with clarity, with courage. And every evening, as the land turned gold beneath the setting sun, Abe found her on the porch, in the garden, beside the stove, and touched her hand like it was still the first time. She always met his eyes. She always smiled. They never once looked back.